recording starts. There we go. The lovely American accent that comes on the screen. Perfect. So hello and welcome to the latest MediMatch webinar. It's a pleasure to have you all here in attendance. My name is Joe Jenkins. I'm the head of growth here at MediMatch. For those who don't know, MediMatch is a technology platform that matches nurses with job opportunities based solely on your job preferences and whereby hospitals directly apply to you rather than spending hours making applications and then weeks or even months waiting to hear back. We also run regular community events like these webinars and also nurse meetups every couple of months. We have one coming up the first Friday of October, which we'll let you guys know all about in due course. So please do sign up at medimatch.io if you haven't already. We'd love to welcome you to our thriving community. Today we're joined by Yun Wang, who's a modern matron at Bupa Healthcare's Cromwell Hospital. As you all know probably by now, Yun will be talking us through how to build a successful career in cardiology. Following on from Yun's presentation, we'll hold a Q&A session in the second half of the presentation. So please do send in all of your questions in the chat function at the bottom of your screen throughout the talk, and then I'll moderate those questions at the end of the session. So Yun, over to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Hi, good evening, everyone. So as Joe's introduction, I'm currently working as modern matron in the Cromwell Hospital. I'm leading the medical department, and that is a mixed medical ward with a dialysis unit within the department. So in today's webinar, I'll be give you a sort of very brief overview of the Cromwell Hospital, what specialty we have in the hospital, and then also an introduction of the department that I'm currently working in. And I'll also be talking about my own sort of my educational and career journey so far. I've joined Cromwell Hospital in 2011, so nearly 11 years ago, and I would say the majority of my career are in the Cromwell. And I will also be talking about why do I think it's good to work for the Cromwell Hospital and why I have stayed in the Cromwell for so long. And for those of you who are interested in developing a career in cardiology nursing, and since majority of my career are in cardiology nursing, I will be talking about things the career development pathways and then courses and knowledges and skills that you might need to develop before or while you are in cardiology nursing. And then at the end, we will have a Q&A sessions where you can ask questions. So, so first of all, about Cromwell Hospital. Not sure if many of you are familiar with the hospital, but certainly a lot of you would have heard about Bupa. So Cromwell Hospital is the only Bupa hospital in the UK, and Bupa is a international company that was initially started in the UK in 1947. So it has a long history. It initially started as a private health insurance company, providing private health insurance to public. And then it started as a charity, so there's no shareholders, or the sort of business profit gets then reinvested back into the business. So over the years, the business has really grown and developed into many different areas in healthcare. So we have a hospital like the Cromwell Hospital. We have a lot of nursing homes in the UK as well as in other countries. We still, health insurances still take a large proportion of our service. And then also we are developing into the health assessment clinics as well as the dental services and GP services, etc., etc. You probably see the Bupa, the brand everywhere. But the hospital in the UK at the moment, we only have one, and that's Cromwell. We got hospitals in Spain, in Poland, in other countries. So the Cromwell Hospital is located in the in central London. It's in the very affluent Kensington area. It's right next to 3 tube stations, so it's a very convenient location for a lot of people. The hospital has it's a very small hospital compared to hospitals in Asia. In the country where I'm from China, so I used to work in a public hospital with 3,000 beds. But the Cromwell Hospital currently with inpatient beds, we have just about 100 beds. But we cover a very wide sort of range, a very wide variety of specialties. So we have a medical ward that covers medical ward covers cardiac, neuro, renal, and dialysis unit, and then oncology floor, we have oncology inpatient, oncology chemo day unit as well. And then we've got the surgical floor that covers all sorts of surgeries as well as orthopedic surgery as well. So we do things, we do a lot of day cases, small procedure, but we also do very complex procedures such as liver transplant, kidney transplant, and in the cardiac ward we do lots of big cardiac surgery like CABG or aortic valve replacement, etc. So it's small, but it does cover all sorts of specialty. We have our cardiac cath lab as well. In oncology, we do gamma knife. We have our radiotherapy unit. It's almost everything you can see in NHS. Or the procedure you can see in the NHS, you can see it in Cromwell Hospital. And the consultant that works with us or works for us are usually very well-known, sort of like leading expert in a specific specialty. So it's a exciting opportunity. Where also the hospital is also expanding. We've recently sort of acquired the space next to the hospital. Used to be a hotel, and the hotels closed it down during COVID period, and we got the opportunity to get that hotel and then be developed into part of a Cromwell Hospital. So the future of the hospital is really bright. Our mission, that's Bupa mission, is to help people live longer, healthier, happier life, and making the world a better world. And that's not just to, the mission is just not just to help our client live longer, healthier, and happier, but also our staff, our employee. The value of Bupa is brave, caring, and then responsive. All these values are very close to my heart, and then choosing to go into nursing, and it's because you want to be caring for people, want to be responsible for people's the illness and suffer. So and I felt when I joined Bupa, I felt the mission and the value was very close to my heart, and that's probably why I stayed in Bupa for so long. Just go to the next slide, please. So about the department that I'm working in, it's the medical department. So we have mainly cardiac services as well as neuro services, but then almost any other patient that's not for surgery in the hospital or not for oncology treatment would be admitted into the medical department. So then we see patients that's endocrinology, renal patients, and any other medical conditions, and respiratory also is a big part of our ward. We have lots of chest infection patients, asthma, COPD, etc. So we also, although it's medical department, but any cardiac surgical cases or respiratory, so thoracic surgical cases would be coming to our department as well. We have a quite a large number of cardiac angio cases. So we do cardiac angiogram, angioplasty, ablations, pacemaker, CRTD insertion, as well as TAVI, that's aortic valve implantation. So as you can see, it's a very mixed department, and therefore it's a challenge for I would say it's a challenge for nurses' skills. If you go into NHS, if you choose a let's say cardiac ward, you probably mainly see cardiac patients. But in our department, we do require nurses to have very wide sort of range of skill mix, and that's because the client that we're looking after comes with all different conditions. But we do have very good program to develop our nurses into to all these different skills of different specialty. So the picture that I've got here is some of my teams. And then the ones on the top right corner is actually one of our cardiac study day we just finished on Friday. And then these sort of study days, we run it quite frequently in the department. It is in our head office. It's not within the hospital. It's done offsite in our head office in Bupa headquarters. So that's the medical team. Within the medical team, we also got a dialysis unit. We are a small dialysis unit that has seven beds and then plus a isolation room. So 8 beds in total. Is a very small team. It covers all the outpatient dialysis service as well as AICU dialysis patient, also inpatient dialysis patient. We do have mobile dialysis unit, not that dialysis machine that allow us to dialyze patient anywhere in the hospital. So that's the medical team. The ward has currently 24 beds. It has capacity of up to 34 beds, but because our outpatient services, it seems to be really busy during COVID time, so we sort of turned 10 beds to be to provide outpatient service. But when we do when the neighboring hotel being developed into the outpatient service, we will then return those beds back into inpatient beds. So we will have a capacity of about 34 beds. Within the team, we have 14 staff nurses, 8 clinical team leaders, and then 8 healthcare assistants, and then 1 deputy matron and 1 modern matron, and also have 1 clinical nurse specialist and 1 clinical nurse educator. So it's we also have few international nurses, and that's to the audience here. If you are an international nurse or you know someone who's an international nurse currently abroad, wants to join UK, wants to come to UK, you can join our international nurses pathway. So in the picture, there are 2 of my staff. They are currently going through the international nurses OSCE exam, and once they get the PIN number, then they will work as a qualified nurse in the team. But we do provide them once they, I think, when they are in their home country, they will need to be finishing the computer-based exam as well as the language test. Once they've done that, we can then provide a visa to bring them over and prepare for the OSCE and then start working here. So we are working with a agency on this program. We currently have vacancy for a clinical team leader and then staff nurse. It's I would say it's very initially can be quite challenging for someone to join this team because of the wide range of patients we get, but it's very rewarding. I started my career in this department, and although in last 10 years I spent 5 years on doing the job outside of this department, but eventually returned to this department as a matron. So I would welcome all of questions in the Q&A section if anyone wants to join my team. So next slide, please. This one is about my own sort of education history. So I got trained to be a nurse in China. I started university in 2002. It's a 4 years program in China, the bachelor degree program. So when I finished the study, I worked in China in Shanghai for 2 years, and then I came over to UK for personal reason. But when I came over, I I it took me a while to pass the English IELTS exam. It took me 5 times to pass. So while I was preparing, in those days, it was still we were still doing the overseas nurse program. So you need to pass your IELTS, and then you then go on an adaptation program. So while I was preparing for my IELTS, I decided to get on the master study. So I applied for University of Edinburgh and finished a master study. By the time I finished master study, I was able to pass my IELTS as well, and then got on the overseas nurse program, and then got qualified in 2011, and then joined Cromwell Hospital as a staff nurse. After joining the hospital, then I had many have done many modules in level 7 modules in university, and those are all sponsored by Cromwell Hospital. I did cardiology nursing in King's College. I did acute unwell patient in St. George's University, and then mentorship course as well. And then when I was doing site lead job, I did advanced life support, as well as became an IOS instructor, and those programs are done in St. Thomas Hospital. I also had a Bupa leadership program, and then improvement practitioner program. Those are all funded by Bupa, and those are apprenticeship program. So these are my education history. And next slide, please. So career journey is actually quite, for me, it's quite simple. I only worked 2 years as a staff nurse in China, then came over as overseas nurse and joined Bupa after I got my PIN number, and stayed there since. So started as a staff nurse in cardiac ward. Spent about 2 years being a cardiac staff nurse, and then moved into a senior staff nurse role, and stayed on the role for about a year. And then there was an opportunity came because the cardiac ward sister had a 1 year of maternity leave. So I then took on the interim role of ward sister for a year. And when she returned from the mat leave, there was an opportunity of developing a cardiac and respiratory CNS role. That was because in that particular year, we were extremely busy with cardiac cases, because we had many, I think NHS had many sort of like a long waiting list for cardiac surgery. So we had 3 contracts with different NHS hospitals for them to bring in NHS patient to have operation done in the private hospital. And then because of the demand, and then we decided to develop the cardiac and respiratory CNS role. So I then became the first cardiac and respiratory CNS in the hospital. I stayed on that job for about 2 years, established the role. Then there was an opportunity came for a clinical site manager role. And then moved on to that role. And the reason I moved on to clinical site manager was very personal as well, because I then got married, had 1 child, and the shift pattern of the CNS was not good for me and my husband. So the time arrangement, and then childcare, etc. So I moved on to clinical site manager role, and stayed on that job for 5 years until quite recently. I thought I would be, I am quite enjoy the clinical side of nursing, and I always wanted to sort of stay as close to patient as possible. But it has come to a point. So when I was doing clinical site manager role, I was still quite clinical, and I enjoyed the job really quite a lot. But then 5 years down the line, you kind of reach a point where you feel sort of like you're very comfortable in that role. There's not a lot more skills that you learn from that role. There's not a lot of development required for that role anymore. So then the opportunity of the modern matron for the medical ward came up, and so I decided to move on to the modern matron role. So it's I mean, you can see it's quite sounds like quite a smooth journey. Stayed in one hospital and moved on from band 5 to band 8 in about 10 years time. Um, but I'm also, I mean, for the modern matron role is relatively new for me. I'm also adjusting myself to the role, and there's many moment of doubts whether I'm right for this job, because I lost I mean, a lot of contact with the patient, which I enjoyed the most when I mean, as a nurse. But it's I would say a self-reflecting and learning process, a constant learning process in nursing. So next slide, please. Why work for the Cromwell Hospital? Obviously, for the part of the reason for having this webinar is also to attract people to work, for us to come and join us. And so I want to talk about a bit why work for the Cromwell Hospital. I certainly, in last 10, almost 11 years, I never thought about I want to leave the Cromwell. I enjoyed the environment, the working place so much that I just I didn't think I need to look for another job in a different place. And the reason I think, I mean, my summary is that is because the hospital really cares about its people. And that's in line with our value, as I mentioned earlier. Our value is to help people to live a happier life, and that includes our employee. I do feel we have lots of benefits that other hospital that does not offer, and we take making our workplace a better place for our people very seriously. You see lots of activity going on in the hospital to constantly sort of improving our working culture, working environment. So that's one thing. And the other thing is the investment we have in our people. So as you can see, my own sort of career development and my own educational sort of development, there's been a lot of investment in me from the hospital. And that's not just me. I mean, everyone in the hospital who wants to develop. The hospital is really sort of like investing in the people. We have dedicated training fundings, educational fundings. We send people on to university to do a full-time master course. We send people to do nurse prescribing, acute unwell course, level 6 and level 7, etc., etc. There's and because the company is a company that does not have shareholders, every sort of profit, every penny of the profit gets reinvested in its people, in the service. Therefore, we do have quite a lot of resources available for our people to develop themselves. So as long as we can justify that the development is good for the person, the development is good for delivering the service, it's often supported by the hospital. And then the other thing is I do feel there's a strong culture of empowerment. We sort of constantly asking the questions to our staff, what do you want us to do to make you sort of like make it easier for you to deliver your job. The ideas come from our people, and then we make it into a reality. We have a suggestion box in our ward, and anyone, if they have any idea, they would pick up a slip and then put into the suggestion box. We open it every week and then see what are the suggestions coming from, what we need to improve on, etc. And we have sort of every year we have our staff survey, and from those surveys we might make action plans in based on the feedback from our people. So it's a very strong empowerment culture in the hospital that also kept me in the hospital for so long. I do feel I'm allowed to have my own opinion, allowed to to do things that I think is good for the patient, and that's the most powerful thing. The idea comes from people, and then providing the resources for people to make those ideas a reality. So next slide, please. So I mean, for career development in cardiology, it's similar to any other sort of nursing areas. It's usually have four key areas that you want to develop into. You either education or management, like myself, or research, or being a clinical nurse, clinical specialist in a certain area. So in Cromwell Hospital, because it's a private hospital and it's small, we actually we haven't so touched much on research, but all other roles, we have them in the Cromwell Hospital. We do have a clinical nurse educator within our team, and in all other departments as well. We do have clinical nurse specialists in our team, and obviously managers as well. So we don't have research nurse role. For people who want to develop into research, and ideally I think it should be going to NHS, because there's a lot more funding for research and not a lot more research program. But for any other like areas, education management, and then or become a specialist in certain area, I mean, we have those career development opportunity within Cromwell Hospital. For nurses in cardiology, I mean, I never worked in an NHS, but I have had a very sort of short visit in an NHS hospital. Also I did some placement in an NHS hospital. I mean, they have very sort of much more a specialized area to develop into. For being a cardiac nurse, you can become a arrhythmia nurse specialist, you can become a heart failure nurse specialist, rehab nurse specialist, or some nurses are interested in congenital heart disease and they become a congenital heart disease nurse specialist, or even transplant nurse specialist. In the Cromwell, we have sort of one clinical nurse specialist role that covers both respiratory and cardiac, and her role is mainly about sort of like become the key point of contact for patient, and then also the sort of the bridging person between patient and the consultant. So for example, the CNS would be the ones following the patient's journey from the time patient was booked to come into the hospital for a certain procedure. The CNS would be bringing the patient and getting a history and give some sort of like information to the patient of what to expect before, during, and after the procedure, and then also to conduct a pre-assessment with the patient before patient gets admitted. Once patient is in the hospital, the CNS would follow the journey through and advise and nurses of the patient's progress, and also to update consultant about patient's progress, and also like a follow up post discharge, and also become the point of contact if patient develops any post-op complication or patient has any questions to ask after discharge. So that's the CNS role in the Cromwell Hospital. It does cover some other responsibilities, such as reviewing policies and rewriting policies according to sort of the new evidence, and also to collecting data for national database such as NICO for the cardiac database, etc. So it's not as specialized as in the in NHS, but it all depends on what you want to develop into. Just see what I've got for the sorry, next slide, please. For people who are starting a career in cardiology, I would always advise them, and that's what I do to my new staff who joins cardiology as a new sort of specialty. I mean, the physiology and anatomy of the heart, and that's the basic of cardiology. You need to get yourself sort of educated in that, and that does not, you don't need to do a university course for that. The materials are all there online on YouTube. I do have two very sort of good link to share at the end of the presentation. And then ECG, I mean, I wouldn't expect a newly qualified nurse or someone who joined cardiology as a new staff to understand ECG, but this is something you can learn by yourself. Having an understanding in ECG or able to interpret ECG will hugely so boost your confidence in cardiology. A lot of people sort of dreading going to cardiology or dreading going to work in cardiology department is because they don't understand ECG. Although I would say it's not compulsory for you to know ECG to get into cardiology, but it will certainly will help you take off in your career development by knowing ECG. And also, I mean, understanding the common heart conditions and then the procedure for each conditions will be necessary. Sean did ask for some sort of like interview tips. I mean, if someone coming to cardiac to be interviewed to be a cardiac nurse in my department, I'll certainly be asking the questions of certain cardiac condition and see whether they understand that and what are the treatment for those conditions. Again, these things can be developed, but if you get to know them before you get into that department, first it will help you to get the job, and then also will help you adapt to the department much easier. And things like indication of different heart investigations such as ECG echo, stress echo, coronary angiogram, and then cardiac MRI, etc. These are the things you need to know, if not before you get into cardiac, certainly at the early stage of your career in cardiac. And then also important things, cardiac medication and what do they treat and how they work, and what conditions they cover, what are the contraindications, etc. So those are the, I would say, the knowledges and skills for someone who's starting a cardiology, starting a career in cardiology. There are some courses you can go on to become a cardiology nurse. So I did cardiology nursing in King's College. But would I say that's essential? It's probably not. It's helpful. Again, I did level 7, sort of like because I did master first. And when I chose the modules, I was advised to choose level 7. The problem with level 6 and so level 7 is tend to be sort of more academic and more research based. I would suggest someone who's newly starting a career in cardiology to do level 6, because then you get to learn a lot more about knowledge and skills rather than sort of being very academic. And I also did acute unwell patient course, and that this course is very helpful for nurses, especially for, I would say, senior nurses to manage a very unwell patient, not necessarily for cardiac nurses, but for everyone, for every nurse who needs to take charge in the situation where acute unwell patient needs to be managed. I did advanced life support. And again, I would highly recommend a senior cardiac nurses to do this course. It's about cardiac. It's about resuscitation, but a lot part of the course is about recognizing deteriorating patient and preventing cardiac arrest. And then to understand the algorithm of treating different type of deteriorating patients based on different courses of the deterioration. It's very important in the cardiac ward. So I mean, before I started my before I joined Cromwell, before I even coming to the Cromwell for my job interview, I have very low sort of confidence level because I never had hospital experience in the UK. So I remember I bought a small handbook, cardiology nursing handbook, and I finished reading that book before the day of my interview. And that book is still now sitting on my desk, and till this day is still very helpful. It covers all the basic knowledge that's required. It covers all the conditions, cardiac conditions, all the medications that you need to know in the cardiac ward. So I would also recommend a book like this. It's small, it's easy to read. It would be good to have for someone starting a cardiology career. I'm a visual learner. I like to watch things to learn things rather than listening or reading books. So I use YouTube a lot. For me, there's certainly two source has been hugely helpful for me when I was in the cardiac ward, being a staff nurse. And that link is at the end of the presentation. One is about 12-lead ECG interpretation, and the speaker was, I had many attempts to study ECGs before I came across this source. I often just get lost because it can be so complicated. But after I started learning this one, I think his name is 32 Bravo 711. I still remember his name. So the ECG training he delivered on YouTube was starting from very basic to very complex ECG. And if you follow him on every episode, it will be very difficult for you to get lost in the ECG learning. So very helpful. And the other one is about it's called Storm Medicine. This trainer, I think he's also a professor in the university in America. So he's covered all the cardiac physiology and physical assessment, and that was very helpful for me. It's a very rewarding career to be in cardiac nursing. And the reason being, if you are a cardiac nurse, you can almost certainly feel very comfortable going into any other specialty, because the cardiac system is the base of everything. So most of the time you would find cardiac nurses would be happy to work in surgical, would be happy to work in oncology. But often if you want to move a surgical nurse into cardiac, they will struggle a bit, and they will often find it a bit frightening to start, especially with the ECGs. So I think it's a good specialty to go into for a newly qualified nurse. If you have any questions, please raise it in the Q&A section, and I will be more than happy to answer specific questions. Those are the two links that I talked about. The first one is 12-lead ECG interpretation, hugely helpful. It's overall, I think it's about 40 to 50 hours of videos in there. It took me probably a couple of months to finish it all, but by the time I finished it, I was very good with ECG interpretation, from simple ones to complex ones. And then the second one's cardiophysiology and assessment, and that is just to give you a foundation knowledge of how the cardiac system works. And that's it. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Yun. I would like to take this opportunity to say thank you from everyone at MediMatch first, and also to everyone in the audience as well. Very, very valuable presentation there. So thank you so much for that. We do have some questions that have come in.
Okay.
So what we'll do is we'll go through those, and as we do, please add any further questions as well as we go.
Okay.
The first question, actually, I'll take the opportunity from myself to ask. Is it necessary for an international nurse to have cardiology experience before coming to the UK, or can they have general nursing experience abroad and then come into cardiology in their first job in the UK?
Absolutely. I mean, that's me. I didn't have cardiology experience before I came to UK. So, we are more than happy to train people to be a cardiac nurse. In fact, at the moment in my department, there's only Unfortunately, so at the end of last year, we lost a lot of nurses to the Cleveland. If you know, the Cleveland recently opened a new hospital in London, and they are quite, I mean, they're well known for their cardiac aspect. And then a lot of the cardiac nurses in Cromwell actually moved into the Cleveland hospital. So most of the nurses that's left or newly recruited had no cardiac experience, and hence we were doing all these cardiac trainings and sending people onto cardiac courses in university to develop them into a cardiac nurse. So certainly no, it's not a must. You don't need to have prior experience as a cardiac nurse. We can start from scratch.
Amazing. Another question we have here is, how do you go about building your career in the cath labs without any prior experience in that cath lab specifically?
Right. Okay. So I myself, I don't have experience in cath lab. We do have a cath lab unit in the Cromwell Hospital. I'm not sure whether they take staff that has no experience. The thing is, the cath lab unit in the Cromwell is not as big as the cath lab unit in NHS hospital. I think, I mean, as far as I know, they don't have a sort of a clinical nurse educator either. I think they will be slightly more reserved on taking a new, like a new person who's never had cath lab experience. It's purely because they may not have that manpower to develop that person to be sort of proficient in cath lab cases. I'm not 100% sure that they do. So we'll probably need to speak to the department first. But I'm sure NHS hospital would take newly qualified into cath lab. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And we have a question from a South African nurse who is very eager to learn and is prepared to relocate to the UK as soon as possible. What advice would you give them to prepare to come to the UK if they, let's say, find a job in the next couple of months, whether it's at Bupa or another institution? What advice would you give them in order to transfer over to the UK?
Right. Okay. I mean, South African nurses are amazing, and then there's not sort of like problems with language either. I think they will find themselves quite adapting to the new environment quite easily. I have recruited 2 South African nurses as well recently. For them, their education in South African nursing education is very, very good. They usually come with very strong clinical knowledge. So that wouldn't be a challenge for them. Language-wise, I think English is also a common language there. So language is not really an issue. Culture, again, is probably not going to be as difficult as nurses from like China, from Philippines to settling here. The only thing is, and weather would be a problem because the UK weather is not going to be as nice as probably South African weather. And then also I mean, by talking to the nurses, the 2 nurses that I've recruited, I mean, in London, the cost of living is quite high. And then they're starting as a band 5 nurse. So the rental cost for them, I think they felt it was quite shockingly high, and that they were not expecting that. And looking for accommodation was a struggle for them at the beginning, although they both have found their place now. So I mean, for settling into the clinical environment, it shouldn't be a difficulty because they all felt the working environment here, or the workload here, the work stress level here is sort of is less than in South African hospital. That's the feedback. So clinically, they're adjusting very well. It doesn't seem to be an issue.
Amazing. I think actually it's a bit of a coincidence. We actually, I think, believe from Medimatch provided, I believe, two South African nurses to yourself as well. So whether that's those 2 or the other 2 that are joining soon, I think there's a big South African contingent at the Cromwell, which is great.
Yeah, yes. I mean, there is a big South African community. I mean, when I was in clinical site manager team, 5 clinical site manager, 4 of them are South African. I'm the only one who's not. Yeah. So,
Brilliant. Okay, so what is the difference between cardiology at your hospital compared to an acute NHS trust?
Right. Okay. So acute NHS trust, I would imagine. Again, I never worked in NHS, but they would have much more wider services. So you would probably be having a A&E department that you would take acute MI into cath lab, being having a PCI, and you would have a cardiac ward that looks after patient post-op. You would probably have a CCU unit, a coronary care unit, and then cardiac ICU unit. So in the Cromwell, obviously because of the size of the hospital, we first of all, we don't have a A&E department. We don't take acute cardiac MI case. And we don't do sort of unplanned angiogram angioplasty. So all the cases are planned. Our patients are pre-booked and pre-assessed, and then so pre-planned. And we don't have a dedicated cardiac ICU, and we don't have a coronary care unit, sort of a CCU unit. So all our patient who comes for procedure, if they need intensive care, they would be going to our main intensive care unit. So, I mean, the size-wise is smaller, and the service we provide, we probably do less acute cases. We do or sort of planned cases. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. And for a nurse interviewing for a cardiology role, or even just a medical role, what advice or tips would you give them to sort of shine within that interview? I know there's probably you could touch on, but maybe just a couple of points.
Yeah. Okay. So I can talk about my our interview. We normally we would have a part of the interview is general questions for us to get to know the person, their sort of career history, and then their strengths and weakness. And also the other part is clinical. We'll be asking clinical questions, not necessarily sort of cardiac questions, but we will be based on their CV deciding what to ask in the clinical part. I wouldn't sort of worry too much about cardiac knowledge, because the questions will be tailored to your own experience, but we certainly want you to be able to demonstrate that you are good in what you do. So if you say you come as a surgical nurse and now you're applying for a job in cardiac, I would want to ask you some questions about your surgical nursing and see what your answer would be. So it's a way of sort of measuring were you good in your previous job. And then also I would asking questions like, what have you prepared for being a cardiac nurse? I would want to see some sort of like preparation in cardiac nursing. You don't need to sort of answer questions on ECGs and cardiac post-op care, that sort of things, but we'll need to have a sort of like a small understanding in cardiac nursing, what cases you're expecting to see. I would be asking these sort of questions to show that the desire to be developed into cardiac. For me, the general question bit, I would want to see, because I mean, for nurses, teamwork is very important. I would want to see how you solved problem in the past, and that requires sort of teamwork and things like how you resolved conflict between team members and that sort of things. Yeah.
Right. And would any of the courses you had in one of your slides, would they be applicable? Would they go some way to show that they are able to look within the cardiac unit, or set them apart from other nurses potentially? Are there any sort of free courses that they could do?
So Joe, sorry, your voice break up a little bit. I didn't get the question.
I was just wondering, to sort of add on to that, is there any sort of courses that they could maybe partake in before either coming over to the UK or before joining in an interview with the hospital, to sort of put them in the best place to do that? Any free courses for a non-cardiac nurse?
Okay.
Maybe one standout.
Yeah. Okay. I wouldn't suggest them to go on to a university course before they even get into cardiology nursing, because a lot of the courses you do need to have sort of part of part of it is theoretical learning in school, and then part of it needs to be on clinical base, and then the competency needs to be signed in a clinical setting. So, but like the link I put up, the ECG learning, the cardiac physiology and assessment learning, and also cardiac pharmacology learning, that sort of things. I mean, they don't have to do a university course, but they can just access YouTube to learn those things. And then in the interview, they can present in the interview that I've done this self-directed learning, this and that, and then we can then also ask those questions to maybe test the knowledge.
Amazing. So using these two links, the YouTube links that you provided there, the ECG and the cardiac physiology one, can go some way as well. And I think we'll be able to share the webinar around, so you'll be able to access these links if you want to. If you just obviously email us, we'll be able to provide the webinar to you, the recording as well. A couple of similar questions here. One is about, if you can't get a job directly in cardiology, what specialties do you recommend that are closely linked to cardiology? Someone else has suggested that maybe critical care, working in the critical care unit, is a plus for applying for a role in cardiology.
So critical care, very rarely people go into critical care and wanting to move out of critical care. I mean, a lot of the time, I would say probably surgical nurse want to move into cardiac, or oncology nurse want to move into cardiac. That I see a lot. But for once they started a career in intensive care unit, because the environment is very different from the ward environment. Most of the nurses would get sort of used to this one-to-one care in ITU unit. They will struggle a bit once they get out to the ward environment. Very rarely people would move. I mean, if you can't get into cardiac, respiratory, even endocrine, even renal are good specialty to go into if eventually you want to go into, because they are all very related. Cardiac, renal, and endocrine, respiratory. It's very sort of related specialty.
Okay, perfect. Any final questions? Please add them in now, because we're coming on to the last one or two. Sandra is from Ghana and has asked if you'd like to, if you do recruit from Ghana, and I'm pretty sure I can answer that question for you. As long as obviously they pass the interview, then they're obviously, you're happy to take them from anywhere. So that'd be correct?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yes. Yeah. We recruit from anywhere, and in fact, as I mentioned earlier, we're doing this overseas nurse program. We even recruit before they get qualified. But then, so they need to have an interview with us. If they're already qualified, we'll recruit directly, and then we apply for visa to come over. If they are not yet qualified but planning to become qualified in the UK, we can interview as well. Once they pass the interview, we then sort of forward them on to the agency that we work with, and then they will help them with the visa, preparing for coming over, and then we help them with the OSCE exam here.
Perfect. And then the final question, as we're coming up to the end of the hour, from me, is just sort of how quickly can one expect to transition from a staff nurse in cardiac? Maybe you can touch upon your experiences yourself up into a senior staff nurse level. Do you think?
I think this is very difficult to say it based on individual. I mean, I have staff nurse who's worked in the hospital for 12 years and stayed as a staff nurse. But then I also have people who joined within months, gets promoted into senior. It's very sort of individual. One, you need to demonstrate that you are clinically competent to run a ward. Usually the difference between staff nurse and senior is the staff nurse would be allocated to 4 patients and looking after that 4 patients on her shifts. But a senior staff nurse would expect it to be in charge of the ward for that whole shift. So, I mean, clinically, the senior will need to be competent in dealing with all sorts of different clinical scenario, but also will need to require to have very good organizational skills, because they will be managing the people, 2, they will be managing all different sort of investigations and treatment for the patients. So it's very difficult to say. I mean, you can range from months to years. Certainly, it doesn't. it doesn't depend on how many years you've been a staff nurse, because the years of experience does not make you sort of competent. Yeah.
Amazing. And then the last question that's just come in as you were answering that is, what about the nurse to patient ratio within cardiac nursing? And I'm sure it changes within hospitals, but maybe within Bupa, what would that likely be?
Yeah, so in the medical ward during the day shifts is one nurse looking after 4 patients, and on the night shift is one nurse looking after 5 to 6 patients, maximum 6. And then on top of that, we still have one nurse in charge who does not take patient, but just take a sort of in charge role. And then we also have a clinical nurse specialist in the department, everyday shifts. And then we would have a healthcare assistant. It's usually around one care assistant to 6 patients. So, I mean, the ratio would be, in Cromwell would be, I would say would be better than the in NHS, and in NHS it varies quite quite a lot.
Amazing. Okay, perfect. Well, look, thank you so much for your time. It was a very informative presentation. Really appreciate it. Obviously, coming up to 8 o'clock now, so that is really massive thanks to you for joining us on Sunday night, for leading the presentation, answering all the questions as well. What we'll do is we'll email everyone who's joined the presentation with the webinar itself, with the presentation, and also if it's okay with you, also provide your email address for them to be able to email you any sort of last minute questions they may have as well, if that's okay.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Amazing.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, and sign up to MediMatch as well.
Thank you so much, Yun. Thank you, guys.
Amazing.
You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.